educate myself to understand their point of view. And you know, that's where my first sort of wrestling with objectivity came about. And then it's just very hard to look at a paper like the New York Times and think it's always objective. I think there's some good reporting in the New York Times. I find good reporting in the New York Times, but they were kind of cheerleaders for the war in Iraq. I mean, they had journalists who were out there very supportive of the war and publicly supportive of the war.
It's more of a pretense. It's more of a pretense of objectivity, wouldn't you say?
Well, they're always talking about objectivity, but I don't think they're being objective. I think often they're not being objective. I mean, now, if you can be objective and say, well, I am objectively quoting Obama's spokesperson about the drones and that they are killing, the Obama administration says that 10 militants were killed. Now we're finding out that militants is a word that means any military-age male. If they don't know for sure that he was a civilian, they just call him a militant. Now what, journalists, if you just report on what the administration says, all you're doing is just being an objective mouthpiece for what they said. I mean, a journalist has to go and find out what's up. Has to maybe analyze those casualties. That's what journalism is about.
Yeah, and that segues nicely into what you referred to in one of your notes. Joe, throughout the book, writes sort of endnotes to each section or each piece, which are very illuminating. And one of the things you talk about is the he said, she said form of journalism. And one of the things you wrote in one of your pieces on the Palestinian territories is that you thought that piece, that particular piece, was one of your least successful journalistically. And I read your endnote after I had read the comic, and I was actually surprised that you wrote that, because I thought it was not only successful, but it was one of your most polemical pieces. Now,
The one about Hebron?
yes,
Oh.
yes. Joe has a character. He was a Jewish settler named Wilder.
David Wilder.
Yes. And although you did quote him, your quoting him struck me as underscoring the fatuousness of his position, because you juxtaposed that pretty severely with the reality that he was talking. So I thought it was interesting that you thought that was your least successful form of journalism in the book, and I was also surprised the time allowed you the latitude to engage in what I thought was a slightly more polemical mode.
Well, I'm glad you say that, but I guess, you know, I know my internal workings, and it's not that I felt I was pulling my punches with that thing, but I had basically a day with the settlers, and what I should have done really is engage with settlers that were not versed in spinning things. That would have been maybe more interesting than talking to Wilder, who was, I thought, a pretty savvy spokesman for that cause.
But very, very obviously self-interested.
Yes, a very self-interested one, but I felt that I could have done more. If I really was going to show the Israeli side, I could have done more than just quoting a spokesperson. And I did try. I mean, my feeling is the only reason you quote a spokesperson is to measure what they're saying against the truth. You know, that's kind of how I tried to use him in a way. But looking at that piece, I don't feel I really conveyed the full weight of what's going on in a town like Hebron. Now, part of that has to do with the amount of pages they gave me. What I've discovered is in 4 pages, it's very difficult to get into a very complex subject if it's comics. Now, that's the advantage of writing. In 4 pages, you can do a lot, and most people don't even want to read 4 pages. Anyway, it was sort of a. I'm glad you liked that, or you felt that worked, because maybe I'll change my mind. And the second edition will have a Gary Groth comment in there.
Yes. All of your books should have a comment on it. Now, one of the things about this book, I should probably warn everybody here, is that to me, and I haven't actually finished the entire book, I read about 2/3 of it, is that it is a book full of despair. I mean,
That's how the world is, folks.
Yeah.
Outside that little bubble, you know.
That is how the world is.
Yeah.
I mean, did you feel that way? Maybe just briefly, but before I launch into my next question based upon that premise.
I'm a pretty positive person, personally. You know me. I mean, I'm not.
You're always up.
I'm bubbly. But I mean, and I never really had an agenda of trying to pick despairing places.
Like a coincidence?
Well, I mean, I care about these places, but it's not that I don't have like a goth sort of thing, going. I'm not a goth journalist. Well, but over time, you realize that there are a lot of people in this world, including in America, because I have another book that's out this month with the journalist named Chris Hedges, and it's about America, and you also see despair and even third world conditions in the United States. And it's really sobering. And yeah, I mean, at a certain point, it sort of fills you up.
One of the best pieces I thought that I've read in the book so far is your very last piece, very extensive piece on India. I mean, one of the longer pieces on India, and which is a bit outside of your traditional bailiwick. But that piece struck me as demonstrating a kind of hopelessness, I mean absolute hopelessness, as to how the weak, the powerless, and their position, how it's almost beyond belief that they can improve themselves, based upon their position relative to those in power, and even those in power just barely more powerful than they are. I mean, you have a hierarchy, a caste hierarchy in India, as you exhibited it, where even those with marginally more power are grasping for that level of power and pushing down those beneath them. It almost struck me as a kind of reductio ad absurdum of what America, what the right wing is trying to do to America, notwithstanding our withering middle class. I don't know. Can you talk a little about? I guess what I'm asking is, can you talk a little about maybe using India specifically, but more generally, that you gravitate toward the weak, toward the powerless, and demonstrating this vast gulf between those with power and those without, and the fact that those without seem never to be pretty hopeless in terms of ever acquiring enough power to get out of this situation.
Well, I mean, we've all heard the stories that India is doing much better now. And I mean, if you look at things like gross domestic product and all the metrics of economics, you can say that's true. It has a very good growth rate, but it also has one of the highest incidents of malnourishment in the world. And it's not that India isn't economically moving, and it's not that a middle class hasn't expanded, because it has, and I saw that. But I'm always interested in the stories that begin to get left behind when you start measuring success in terms of these economic metrics. A lot of people are left behind in India and in other places in the world. And India was interesting to me because, as you said, as someone mentioned to me who knows this stuff very well, he said the untouchables practice untouchability with each other because there are different subcastes within the Dalits, the so-called untouchables. And if you are if you've got just a bit of if your group is considered just a bit higher than the one below you, you tend to lord it over those people. Or if you if you are from the lowest caste and you become a village chief, because now there's like a quota system, the village chief tends to suddenly be used by people of a higher caste to sort of do their bidding, but he personally will do well. And he's happy to do well. And it's not so much about India or America or anything like that. It's, after a while you begin to think, boy, this is human nature. There's something about us as a species that's really sort of troubling in a way. It's like why, I had a conversation with someone yesterday, an African-American guy. We were talking about poverty. He'd done some work in Appalachia with white poor folks. And white poor folks don't like to think of themselves as poor. That's something that African-Americans are, even though they're in the exact same class. If you have to look at it economically, they're both groups are dirt poor, but one doesn't want to call itself poor. This sort of stuff sort of intrigues me. Like, what's going on there? I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but ultimately I am drawn to stories of people who don't have much say in matters.
I think it's corroborating my view of despair.
But, I mean, the truth is, and this is the really unfortunate thing, it's the hardest thing about doing this kind of work is, you talk to people, you get to meet them, and then you walk away, and you know you're going to do your story, and you're going to get paid for it, and then you're going to get a plasma TV to go on your wall, and they're going to be in the same situation.
Right, so that was my next question, which is, I mean, doing this kind of work seems to me like on the one hand it would be enormously fulfilling because one of your trademarks is that you impose a moral point of view on your stories, and I think that sort of demythifies the whole objectivity of journalism, that you are imposing a moral point of view, and yet, if nothing changes because of it, if the entire global structure remains the same or worsens, I mean, that just has to be a despairing thought. You know, Fitzgerald said that the hallmark of a first-rate mind was the ability to hold two conflicting thoughts in your mind at the same time. That seems to be what you have to do all the time. I don't know if that's a question, but how do you deal with that?
You know, at some point, I mean, it's nice being here and meeting people like you, because I know people like you read my books and you often tell me you've learned something, and I really appreciate that. So I do think, okay, maybe there's something gotten out of this, but does it actually help? That's a question I tend to ask myself more and more and more. And I'm simply not sure how to answer that question, except to say that any act that you do that you think it's the right act to do, you do it, and where it goes, it goes. And what good it does, but as a human being, that's what you have to do. You know, whether it moves mountains or doesn't do a damn thing, that's what you had to do. And that's kind of how I leave it.
Yeah, you have to be compelled to do what you think is right. On that note, can we, let's open it up and ask, I have a few questions here. And since this book just came out, obviously it doesn't have to be about this specific book or these works, but I'm sure a lot of you have read works that Joe's done in the past, or if you just have any general questions about journalism or comics.
Do you feel like you're equally involved in the journalism community and the comics community?
Should I repeat the question? Did everyone hear that? The question was, does Joe feel as if he is equally involved in both the comics and the journalism communities?
Well, the short answer is yes, because I have a lot of friends among journalists, and when you're abroad and you meet journalists, I mean, as long as you can talk about the stuff in the same sort of level, then you're in. And I never had a problem with, I always thought I would have a problem with other journalists, but I never did. In fact, they liked the idea of what I was doing. But definitely I have cartoony comics friends and journalism friends, and I kind of like straddling both worlds.
Let me ask you a question. In your piece on The Hague, you wrote that there were two women, I think were they prosecutors?
Well, one was the president, I think, of the
tribunal. Anyway, they provisionally agreed to give you an interview, and then they more or less backed out. And then you had a 45-minute conversation with them where you tried to persuade them. Yeah, you're shaking your head in despair. Where you tried to persuade them to talk to you, and then they only agreed to talk to you after all of that time off the record, or for background. And I'm not sure if you actually did talk to them. It was a little unclear to me. But was that because you practiced journalism in the cartoon form, or was that because you were a journalist at all, or what was their hesitation and trepidation?
Yeah, just for some background.
Okay,
this was The Hague, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and I went there for a couple of weeks and watched some of the trials. And this was a piece that was commissioned by Details magazine when Art Spiegelman was the comics editor for a short time there. And you know, my reporting was going well. I was getting the information I needed. But I thought the jewel of my interviews would be questioning the president of the tribunal, and I think it was the chief prosecutor. And both of these women are people I really admired. But I sat with both of them. I thought I was having some time with one and then some time with the other. But they called me into their office, or an office, and they were both there. And they had some of my comic books in front of them. They managed to get some comic books. I think one of them had a relative in Seattle and got them from probably your bookstore. And they had a copy of Details, and they were saying, you know, one of them began reading some of the depositions from some of these court cases, which are really horrendous. And it was really insulting to me. You know, I'd spent time in Bosnia. I knew what was going on. She didn't need to tell me, by reading me these quotations from a deposition, how serious this stuff was. Now, when I asked her, is it because it's comics? You're not interested in talking to me because I'm doing this in comics form? They just assured me it wasn't. I don't really believe that, to be honest. They also had a copy of Details magazine, which they were leafing through and saying, well, look at these pictures of these scantily clad women. And now, why would it be appropriate to have an article about the criminal prosecution of war criminals? Why would that be appropriate in this magazine? And I tried to convince them, like, maybe these people should find out about this, or don't you speak to Italian journalists? Have you ever looked at an Italian magazine, for God's sakes? But, you know, it was like I couldn't make any headway with them. And in the end, I got them to agree to do interviews with me, both of them, totally off the record, which really spoiled my piece, because in the end, I have to pontificate about why it's important to have the Hague Tribunal when they should have explained it to me. I was insulted, frankly.
Any questions?
Yeah, hey, what's this we hear about a Rolling Stones, a guide to the Rolling Stones? What's this?
Still coming out.
Yeah.
Wait for it, everyone. It's coming out as soon as they tour.
Hey, I want to sell some comic books, so.
Okay, well, let me ask, Larry wants to sell comics, I want to sell comics.
All right.
Let me ask one last question, which is that, based on your own depiction of yourself in here, you have an enormous amount of patience. And I guess you have to have an enormous amount of patience being a journalist on the ground. But one thing I noticed in your India trip, Joe is speaking to some of the untouchables, the Dalits, and he was in their hut, and you had one of the enforcers, one of the green shirts, as you referred to them, basically just storm in and end the interview, and then you were subsequently surrounded by what you referred to as the teenagers, who basically escorted you out. Now, did you ever, was it ever an option for you to just tell them to go fuck themselves and continue the interview, or would that have put your own, would that have impaired your own safety, or the safety of people you were interviewing? And it just looked so frustrating.
Well, it was frustrating, but ultimately you have to worry about the people you're interviewing. I mean, they live within several hundred yards. Their hamlet was several hundred yards from the hamlet where this village basically has about 60-some hamlets. And so people who are higher caste, they know who they know the Dalits amongst them. I'd already caused trouble for these people by talking to them, it seemed. And they wanted, even the Dalits, they realized, okay, yes, please go, you understand our situation. They didn't want me to come back. I went to this place 3 times, and the 3rd time, basically, my guide and I were escorted out. But yeah, I was worried for their safety. You just don't want to cause a ruckus. Telling them to go fuck themselves, that wouldn't be. It's okay for me, I'm getting on a plane in a week.
Well, I wouldn't be that great, right?
No.
And you're not really doing them any good. You're doing the rest of the world good by exposing the truth of that situation, but you're not helping their situation necessarily.
You mean the Dalits?
Yeah.
No. All I can do is talk about it. Well, that's a very good point. For those individuals, that's what you have to always realize is you talk to people and you realize for those individuals, I'm not really helping the individuals. Now, am I really helping by talking about this in a broader sense? I don't know.
Well, I think you are, and I think it would be helpful if everybody bought Joe's book. And we thank you for coming, and Joe's more than happy to talk to you.
Okay, let's have another hand for Gary Groth and Joe Sacco. Again, we have the privilege of having Joe's book 10 days before anybody else on the planet. Joe will be holding court. He'll be able to discuss his work with you informally at the table that has that book. If you don't own Palestine, there's something seriously wrong with you. Safe area and others. So thanks again. We have half-price books in the back, classics here, alternative comics there, and new stuff here. So buy comic books, and thank you again for coming. We'll see you soon.